With the very unfortunate events of the Ukraine in the headlines and the Ukrainian people close to our hearts, I rise today to speak to a topic that has significance not only for that European crisis and for our own well-being, but also bearing a little bit on the longer-term subject of climate change, which of course was a big discussion here last night. This morning I am speaking to the American energy renaissance and its broader benefits to us all. Today, American technology and know-how are delivering energy abundance, keeping energy affordable, enabling energy to be cleaner than the next most likely alternative, permitting us to rely on ever more diverse energy sources, and finally, improving energy security for our people here in this country and around the world. America's overall production of nearly every type of energy is rising. The efficiency of just about everything, whether it's our vehicles or whether it's our buildings, is increasing. And in comparing our supply with our demand, we are rapidly approaching a self-sufficiency rate of 90%. The American energy revolution has generated a variety of welcome benefits. It's created jobs, it's generated revenues, it's helped reduce both energy prices and price volatility. And as our nation imports less, the simple fact is there is more energy available for others. And that, in turn, is creating the kind of supply conditions in the world oil market that allows all of us to deal with the bad actors from a position of relative strength. There was a recent essay in Foreign Affairs that argued that energy has been viewed as a strategic liability in the United States since back in the 1970s. Now, energy is becoming a strategic asset and one that can boost the U.S. economy and grant Washington newfound leverage around the world. It's really hard to disagree with that, Mr. President. But the question then becomes, what will we do with this strategic asset? How will we use our newfound position? There was a survey of responses to Russia's disregard for Ukrainian sovereignty, and of those of prudent areas that the United States might go, energy is clearly among the most major strategic asset that we possess. And how we use it to bring about geopolitical stability can really define our leadership in the world. But our first real challenge here as a nation is, how do we keep this American resurgence going? And there are two specific areas where we have to make some decisions here, and that's whether or not to grant access to new lands and new markets, and that will go a long way in determining whether we actually do that. Now, as I noted, America's total energy production has increased dramatically in recent years, but within those numbers, there's a serious dichotomy here. Nearly the entire oil and gas production resurgence here in the U.S. has occurred on state and private lands, not the million of acres that are managed by the federal government. And despite the discussion of all of the above and no small amount of credit taking by the administration, combined hydrocarbon fuel production on federal lands actually fell from 2008 to 2012. And that, Mr. President, is a disappointing trend that, in my view, needs to be reversed. Consider, for example, the opportunity that we're missing in my state of Alaska. 30 years ago, March of 1984, the Alaskan crude oil production stood at 1.6 million barrels per day. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System had been completed just a decade earlier. There were debates over opening new areas to production and even allowing exports of crude oil from the state. But the federal government did not act at that time. It did not seize Alaska's best and most obvious opportunities. Production peaked at 2.1 million barrels per day in March of 1988. It's been on the general decline ever since then. Alaska's production has dipped below the 500,000 barrels per day marker several times since 2012. This is a fall of nearly 75% from its high. Back home, we keep talking about a pipeline that's less than half full. The difference here is not only geography, it's also policy. Our federal policies are not working as they should. And state policies, combined with private sector inventiveness, powerful as they are, cannot overcome the federal barriers. In North Dakota, where we see a booming energy market, only 4% of that state is federally held. In Texas, it's just 2% of federal lands. In Alaska, 62% of our lands are federal, and most of our untapped resources are in these federal areas. Alaska's falling production is a missed opportunity to create jobs, to generate revenues, to stabilize world energy prices, to diversify world energy supplies, and it's not the only place in America where potential growth is going unrealized. We're passing up tremendous opportunities off of our Atlantic coast, in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and in the Rocky Mountain West. We also have increasingly burdensome regulations that slow the pace of development on the federal lands that are open. And all of this highlights the need to re-examine our federal energy policies and really reorient them for a new century. And that leads us to the subject of exports. Back in January, I laid out the case for why we need to renovate the architecture of the U.S. energy trade. We have substantial opportunities for exports of coal, petroleum products, natural gas liquids, renewable technology, nuclear technology, and even crude oil. So I have called for the lifting of the de facto prohibition on crude oil exports as a preemptive measure. And I say that what we need to do is to lift it to prevent future losses of production and jobs when our trade restrictions inevitably collide with this surge of light oil and the condensate production that comes out. The conversation that I hoped to frame last year in January when I submitted my Energy 2020 report is really very underway. My point is that we must increase the value of energy as an American strategic asset for global security and price stability. Now, Mr. President, I want to say just a couple words here, maybe more than a couple, but a few words about climate change. Many groups have formed to go on the offensive to quote, wake Congress up on the issue of climate. They want to force the nation to talk about the subject no matter what the issue of the day might be. Unfortunately, they also seem to want to blame Republican members and somehow also to adopt policies that this body has rejected year after year. So much of the climate change conversation seems to be defined by old ideas that have been rejected. It seems that if you're not supportive of yet another regulatory edifice, either through cap and trade, a carbon tax, or letting the EPA expand its authority without any checks by the people's representatives in Congress, then somehow or other you're against the environment. I reject that. I want to see greater balance. I know that we can achieve it, and I think it's important that, again, we reframe the conversation here. I think finding agreement on environmental policy, it's hard, but it's not impossible. I think what you need to do is kind of pull back and change the conversation that we're having here. What I want to remind my colleagues, though, is that part of the opposition that I have had to some of the ideas that I've heard from folks is based on what those policies would mean for our affordability of energy. And here I mean not just for Americans who are energy insecure, including residents in my state and some of our most remote areas who already face exorbitant energy costs, but also, Mr. President, the 1.3 billion people across the globe with no reliable access to electricity. Worldwide, families are struggling to attain the basic necessities of life. And although many portray climate change as our most pressing moral issue, I would suggest to you it is but one of many. Energy poverty and energy insecurity are others, and ones that we simply cannot ignore, and we should certainly not make worse. Another part of my opposition to cap and trade or a carbon tax is based on what we've seen in Europe as compared to what's actually happened here in the United States. Without climate legislation, But with the advent of increased domestic production here through shale gas production, our greenhouse gas emissions are now 11% below our rate of emissions in 2005. And yet our friends across the Atlantic, who actually did pass cap and trade several years ago, they haven't exactly seen the expected results. In the face of weak growth, high unemployment, high debt, some European nations are now dialing back the extremely expensive subsidies that they have offered. And at the same time, many of our NATO allies are clamoring for the cheap and the abundant natural gas that we are now producing on our state and our private lands, and they are importing our abundant and affordable coal. The unfolding situation in Ukraine also highlights the compelling importance of energy security, something that neither a carbon tax, cap and trade, or any climate bill that we've seen in the Senate has properly accounted for. And then there's the approach that the president seems to want to take. Earlier this year, he threatened to use his executive authority to regulate greenhouse gases if Congress failed to act. It's really quite a choice here. He suggests either pass legislation that we don't like, or he will enact regulations that we don't like. Either way, to be carried out under the Clean Air Act, just not according to the Clean Air Act. It's difficult to really consider whether or not this is a serious offer. What we can say, though, Mr. President, is that this threat and the rulemakings that will follow is contrary to what our forefathers envisioned. Executive authority forgoes the benefits and protections of the legislative process, and it curbs the debate that is needed to ensure fair and balanced policies. And particularly in this area, we need to ensure that they are fair and balanced policies. To effectively combat climate change, we have to safeguard our economy. Prosperity is key to the resources that we will need to make progress. The nation has to pursue all forms of energy and stress energy security. We cannot exclusively count on renewables to achieve a low-carbon environment. Emission-free nuclear energy has to be part of the solution. Technology must play a role in reaching the goals that we set for our country. And finally, as we discuss the issues and the approaches to these issues, we have to do so with humility, keenly aware of the unintended consequences that could be worse than no action at all. Climate change is a global issue that requires global acknowledgement of the issue and global action. But through it all, we must be deeply concerned and always aware about the impacts of our actions on the individual family. I spent a lot of time, Mr. President, in the rural parts of my state. We don't even call them rural. We use the terminology bush because it is just so remote. And these are areas where the only way to access these communities is either by air or by boat up the river by barge. Supplies are brought in 2 times a year if you live on the river system. You look around, you may be able to see the impact of climate change, and that is an awareness that the people in this region have. But first and foremost, these people need to be able to live. This is where they have lived for thousands of years. But when you appreciate the cost that they are paying for their energy right here and right now, I can't support anything that is going to increase the energy costs for the people in my state who are already paying some up to close to 50% of their income goes to stay warm in the wintertime. I have one letter here that I received just last week from a village by the name of Quigillingok. And this is an area out in the coastal villages region. But in this letter from their tribal council, they state the current cost of heating fuel is $6.02 per gallon. Gasoline is $6.52 per gallon. Now, Mr. Chairman, if I were to suggest to the fine people in Quigillingok that in order to arrest what we may be seeing with increased emissions around the globe, that your energy prices are going to double, that the cost of your heating fuel is going to go from $6.02 per gallon to $12. How do these people live? We have to be aware of the energy insecurity, the energy poverty in far too many places in this country and truly around the world. So as we discuss these very important issues about energy and how we do right by all, again, let's do so with a level of humility and a level of respect for people all throughout our nation. With that, Mr. President, I see that my colleague from Texas is here, another fine producing state, in fact, a state that is really doing quite well right now when it comes to our energy and our energy resources. Through the efforts of states like Texas, North Dakota, California, we are seeing a true resurgence in our energy production. And I think an opportunity for us as a nation to, again, not only provide for our energy security as a nation, but to provide for security and stability on the global scene as well. And with that, I thank the President.